All right. Well, welcome to the show today, everyone. My guest today is Rohit Bhargava. He's the founder and director of Playbook Media, which is an agency that assists startups and businesses of all sizes effectively acquire and convert users using content and sales funnel optimization. He's also the host of the Startup Playbook Podcast, where he's interviewed over 100 successful founders and investors from all around the world. His podcast was ranked number 3 in iTunes when he first launched, and he's been consistently high in the charts since then. I wanted to bring Rohit on the show to find out how he launched and grew his podcast, how that evolved into his agency, and what he's planning next. So, Rohit, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, and glad that we could finally make this happen as well. I know we've been speaking for a few weeks about making this happen, so thanks for being patient with it. But really looking forward to it.
No, absolutely, and I'm glad we could finally make it happen because I've been looking forward to it. It should be a good conversation. So I'd love to start a little bit on your background and your story. So I was wondering if you could just tell the audience a bit about how you grew up and really just what's your story?
Right. What's my story? It's a good question. So I was born in India, moved to Canada when I was 6 months old, and really like travel was a really big part of my life growing up. And I was actually listening to some of your previous podcast episodes as well. And interesting seeing how much of the parallel there is between some of the guests. But I think by the time I got to year 7, I'd been to 7 different schools, not because I got into any trouble, but more because, my family moved around a lot for my dad's work. So lived all around Australia. I moved to Australia when I was about 6 years old, lived in Iran for 2 years in between, which was an incredible experience. And then, eventually sort of ended up staying in one place in Canberra and spending most of my life growing up in terms of high school and university there. I did, went the traditional sort of Indian route of studying a double degree in engineering and economics at uni, and sort of jumped out and joined an engineering company for about 2 years. Which was about as long as I could sort of last inside a corporate environment before jumping out and starting, just jumping out and getting into startups.
It's a cool story. Because, I can imagine you would get itchy feet pretty quickly because it sounds like you're always pretty entrepreneurial. I understand. Maybe you could tell the story about how you used to sell pizza back in high school.
Yeah, I'm wondering where you found that out from. But it actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that I have been pretty entrepreneurial, because for the longest time I didn't actually think that was who I was. And, growing up, it wasn't really a conversation that we had at home. It wasn't really a term that was used either at home or like even within like my friendship group. And it just wasn't anything that anyone really spoke about at all. But when I was in high school, I hated asking my parents for money. And all I really needed was, I needed sort of $25 or so I could go and see movies with my friends and buy some popcorn and things like that. And so I found the best way to do that was to develop a deal with like the local Domino's Pizza franchise, and essentially negotiate an arrangement with them where they would give me really significant discounts if I bulk ordered. There's like a minimum quantity or something like that, pretty much on a weekly basis. And then I just went around selling pizza at discounted rates to everyone in our school. But it turns out that other people were much smarter than I was. And so they would eat half their pizza and sell the rest of the half for a profit.
Yeah, right. So you were selling the whole pizza and they were parting them out by slices. Yeah.
Yeah, which in hindsight is super smart. But again, for me, it wasn't necessarily like I was trying to make a shitload of money or anything like that. It was just more, I just found like, I loved pizza. It made sense to me that like other people would also like it for lunch, instead of being stuck with sort of canteen food or whatever parents had sort of packed into lunch boxes. So. For me, it was just something that, again, like I didn't necessarily sort of pick up on at all, but I always had, I was always the person organizing things. I was always the person that was, trying to find those type of arrangements or things like that. And it wasn't until I got to university where we had to do a course called Young Achievers Australia, where essentially they, I guess as part of an engineering degree, I think they just assume that you're very antisocial. And so they make you do a lot of group assignments. Yeah. And part of the course was that we had to do this Young Achievers Australia program, which is they put you in a group of I think like 15 to 20 people, which is ridiculous. Wow. And you have to try and launch a business. And I remember that was the one course through my entire double degree that I was just completely fascinated with, and just just was completely obsessed with, in a way that outside of sport, I didn't really feel that type of passion towards anything else really. And so after that, tried to launch a few other terrible business ideas while I was at university. And when I finally graduated and moved out to Sydney, I kind of made it my mission to be as actively involved and find out as much as I could about startups, which again, I kind of very unintentionally fell into through a friend. But
tell me a bit about how that actually happened. Sorry to interrupt, Rohit, but I'm curious because it would make sense. You were in these uni classes and you kind of followed your curiosity. You realized that all these other technical engineering classes you weren't really enjoying, but this one class on startups you were loving. So it's a good idea. Makes sense that you would then pursue that and look into it further. But I mean, you've said previously that you're a pretty introverted guy. Obviously, engineers, as you said, tend to not always be the most extroverted people, and I can say that because I'm one as well. But so how did you actually start getting yourself out there and going to all these events? Because that's a pretty hard thing to do, especially for someone who's pretty introverted. So how did that come about?
Yeah, it's funny. Like I think I am introverted, but I think it's one of those things where once you find something that clicks, it's very hard to explain. Like I was like that with cricket as well. So growing up, the reason why I never even kind of looked at business was that growing up, everyone just assumed that I would be like a professional cricketer. And for a long time, that was my kind of career goal and ambition. Long story short, I got into like academy in India and things like that for cricket. But that career, unfortunately, for various reasons, didn't work out. But I felt like a completely different person when I was playing cricket and I was on the field and I was in my element. And startups and business, it was just one of those things where it was a combination of, I was, for some reason, I was just completely drawn to it the moment that I was kind of part of it. But also, I think the people that I got to interact and engage with were people that I felt were very, thought in a very similar way to me. And it was just something that really becomes very intoxicating. And I guess prior to that, I hadn't really had that previously. Like I always kind of felt like the black sheep of, I remember I had friends who would sit me down and have conversations with me about, why wasn't I studying and why was I trying to, take up like sports coaching or like doing all of these random activities or trying to launch different businesses when I was at university to get good grades. And I just never sort of clicked for me, but with some of these other things they did. So I like it. Again, it's very, very hard to describe, but it's just one of those things where for me, it just something kind of clicked and fell into place. And it was like I couldn't help myself in terms of wanting to get involved and wanting to find out more and trying to meet more people and all of those things as well.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's so true. When you find the right people, you find your kind of tribe, it just makes things a lot easier to go to those sort of things. So I totally get that. So what happened next? So you go into all these events about startups, sort of starting to build your network, I guess. How long were you sort of going to those things, and I guess what was your next moves from there?
Yeah, I think like the first phase for anyone who's interested in entrepreneurship is, you try and I think absorb as much information as possible. And back then there wasn't really like the proliferation of podcasts at all. This is like 7 or 8 years ago, maybe even longer. And the best way or like the easiest way to find out information was to literally physically go to events or read blog posts or those sort of things too. But for me, a lot of it was going to these types of events. And I think, as is the case with most people, I had a range of terrible business ideas. There was one that I was working on for a really long time, which was very much tied to my passion, my experience in wanting to play cricket professionally. And and getting into an academy in India and getting sort of world-class coaching, and that sort of opening the doors to getting offers for trials with county teams and things like that in England. And I remember thinking that, I was very fortunate to get into this academy in India and have the opportunity to go over there, and getting access to these coaches was incredible. Why can't other people have that as well? And so the first idea, which I haven't really spoken about much since then, was in sports tech. And I was dealing with a former Australian international cricketer and trying to get him on as a co-founder of the business. I was talking to Cricket Australia about the solution of what I had, and I think for them it was just like, who is this 20-something-year-old kid who's telling us how we should run our business, and all those sort of things. And I just found with that particular business there was just so many variables that were being held back by key stakeholders, that unless if I got specific buy-in, I wouldn't be able to move forward with. And I think I found that very frustrating, because I didn't really understand that at that time. I didn't understand why people didn't see the solution in the same way that I did. And I remember I got really frustrated and came down to Melbourne, because I was based in Sydney at the time, and went to a competition called Startup Weekend, which for those listeners that may or may not be familiar with, is essentially a 48-hour hackathon where you try and convince other random people who are as crazy as you are to spend the entire weekend working on an idea that you have, and then you pitch at the end with any validation that you have. And so I went down with this idea for a crowdfunding for fashion platform, which is at the very early stages. But I just thought, it's an interesting idea. I think it's got legs. I just want to spend a weekend doing something that isn't the sports tech idea. And I remember just over the course of the weekend, we didn't end up winning, but I think we came second. We were offered investment before the judges' scores came out. We had an advisory board set up, one of which was my mentor. He was the co-founder and CEO of a company called LifeX, which was the most successful crowdfunding campaign at that time. I think they'd raised 1.3 million in 3 days. And it just felt like I had made so much more progress over a weekend than I had over the previous months, dealing with all of these other stakeholders, that it was just kind of just one of those feelings of momentum and traction of like, A, what have I been doing? And B, this other idea just seems to be doing so much better. Maybe I should spend sort of more time focusing on that. So I went back to Sydney. We had 9 people that joined the team, which is also very rare. At Startup Weekend, if you get 3 or 4 people, you're doing quite well. We had 9, which was trying to deal with 9 co-founders in a business right at the very start is an interesting experience, and a lot that you sort of learn from that sort of time period. But I guess from that moment on, it was just more trying to figure out, is this really what I want to do? Do I kind of want to jump in? And, I guess prior to that, even while I was working at an engineering company, for context, I kind of knew very quickly that it wasn't really what I wanted to do longer term. So I had actually turned down, so I'd been given 2 job offers, one which was a full-time job that paid a little bit more, and it was a permanent job, but it was in sales. And this other job, which was at an engineering company, which paid a little bit less, and it was only a 3-month contract, but it was working directly with the vice president in a very small team. So it would just be me and her. And we would be doing some really interesting work in looking at sort of environmental policy, and global advocacy was a division, and looking at the Southeast Asia sort of region. And I remember thinking very early on that, so I ended up taking the engineering job, obviously, because, sucker for punishment, and I like taking risks, I guess, when it comes to the career. But I remember thinking very early on that, I do, like, it's an incredible opportunity and I'm learning a lot and I do really like this, and my boss was absolutely incredible, but I knew that it wasn't something that I would that I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing, in the same way that I would go to startup events every night and work on different ideas, or do readings until like, midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning, or just work on different things. There was no way that I would want to do that for my work willingly.
Yeah.
And so, trying to explain to your Indian parents that you want to quit your engineering job after doing a double degree in that to go and start a fashion tech startup is a very interesting conversation to have. But I negotiated with them that if I stayed for at least 2 years, I would, from their perspective, I would at least have something on my resume, so that if something was to fall over and I was to go back, I would have something to fall back on. But if I lasted that time period, then they would leave me alone and let me do my thing, which is pretty big. So I lasted 23 months. I lasted 23 months before I called it quits and packed up everything, dumped my at that time girlfriend of 4 years, and kind of jumped head into startup land in Melbourne.
Wow, it's an amazing story and a big leap. What gave you the confidence to do that? Because I guess where did the idea for Stage Label come from, and then why did you have so much confidence in that you did decide to just go all in and make those extreme changes?
Sure. So the idea came from reading a book called The Lean Startup by Eric Rice, which you may be familiar with. It's definitely like, it's kind of the Bible of the startup space, which is anyone who's kind of new to the space is the first book that most people recommend that you read. And essentially the premise of the book, you don't have to read the book. The whole premise of the book is, testing and validating things and building things that people want rather than working on assumptions. And I'm like, this is such a simple concept. It makes total sense. But this entire book talks about how you can apply it to a particular project or a business. In my mind, why couldn't you apply it to an entire industry? And through the Young Achievers Australia program, and we tried to launch a fashion brand, which was its kind of own little experience. But I had a couple of friends who were fashion designers who were extremely talented, but they made some terrible business decisions. They ended up spending too much on inventory and stock of items that they just couldn't sell, and they had to go out of business before they even really started. And to me, that was always a terrible model for running the business. So the idea was, how can we help fashion designers specifically test and validate individual items from their collections? So whatever resources that they wanted to create in the production, they would at least know that they're devoting it to products that are likely to sell versus hedging their bets and spreading it out over all of the items over their collection. In terms of what gave me confidence, it's really hard because there was a lot of momentum, and by the time that we had launched, which was after I had quit, I think it was very quickly after that we were named as one of the top 10 startups to watch in 2014, alongside companies like Canva and Pocketbook.
Wow.
We had a lot of great traction. Like, A, we had no business being on that list whatsoever. B, we, from like an outsider's perspective, we had a lot of great traction. So, we were doing our own runway shows for Melbourne Spring Fashion Week and Virgin Australia Melbourne Fashion Festival. We were partnering up with Uber when Uber first launched in Australia. Like, again, from the outside looking in, it looked great. But I think for me, in terms of like going back to your original question of why I decided to go down that path and take that risk, I think for me, it was probably less so that I was 100% certain that the idea would work. I was confident that the idea had legs, but I think for me, it was more about I didn't want to live with the regret of not trying that. So I didn't want to get to a stage where I, got to sometime later in my life and said, what if I had taken that leap of faith and not tried? And so I think for me, like I was, and I think it's also the case with most entrepreneurs as well. It's, I think there's this fallacy that you assume that things will always work. And even for a lot of successful businesses, there are like tremendous moments of doubt. And I don't think that it's about ignoring that or not realizing that it's there. I think it's more understanding that there is a huge level of uncertainty, but often the driving factor is that, A, yes, things might not work out, but I don't want to live with the regret. But B, oftentimes, even if it doesn't work out, it's not the worst case scenario. And sometimes you can even come out ahead as a result of that. So, so that's, which is also hard to explain to people that I don't think that are in the space who, for a lot of people, I remember I had an intervention with my friends when they sat me down and said, why are you leaving your job to start a startup? And it's very, very hard to explain that kind of feeling of regret or feeling that you have to do something to other people.
I get it. It's, I guess, similar to what Jeff Bezos talks about, regret minimization, just thinking how likely are you to look back on this and regret doing it or not doing it, and then looking at what is the worst case scenario. Is it actually that bad? And if not, why not? So I totally get that. And you mentioned all these partnerships you got, like with Uber and Fashion Week and all that. Were you the sales guy for them? Who was setting them up? Because they're pretty. How did you actually get them going?
Yeah, I was the only non-technical founder in the team. So we ended up with 4 co-founders, two others that were the original from the original startup weekend, myself, and then I eventually roped in one of my best friends from high school. I think a lot of those things were just timing, but also I think a lot of sales in general is understanding that it's less about you and more about the person on the other side of the table. So Uber, for example, came about because they had just launched in Australia, and I had been introduced to essentially their one person in Melbourne at that time. It was the entire Uber staff was a team of I think 3 people or so, and he was the very first hire here, and yeah, essentially we were just kind of talking. The reason why he wanted to chat was, they were obviously looking to get more engaged into the fashion community. So Uber at that time only really had Uber Black, so it was a more kind of expensive premium type of service. They really wanted to break into that sort of fashion socialite type of community, which is essentially what we were sort of working with. And at that time, we happened to be running our first major runway show at Fashion Week, and so we just offered them a way to access this particular audience by giving sort of free rides to people, which at that time, again, it sounds crazy now, but for 90% of the people that were there, it was their first Uber ride. The very first time that I got into Uber was at that for that event. And so I think a lot of the partnerships that are developed is from less so around why you want them to partner up with you, but more trying to understand what can you bring to the table, what's a sort of unique perspective, what access can you provide, what's in it for them necessarily than compared to what's in it for you.
Yep, makes total sense. It's good advice. Good thing to keep in mind whenever you're selling something, what's in it for the other person. So what happened to Stage Label? Why aren't you still running that today?
Multiple reasons. So, I mean, again, as I mentioned earlier, from the outside looking in, things were really good. We were doing these, major runway shows, and we were sort of pretty constantly getting press for things. But essentially the business model was very broken. So our entire model was that we would take a commission on sales that are going through. But one of the challenges that we found was that because we were working with emerging designers primarily, a lot of them needed support in establishing their online brand and helping them with pricing and essentially helping them build up that initial audience that we needed them to have to be able to sell through our platform, which takes a lot of time and resources to develop. And like with anything, there are particular businesses that will be much more successful than others for various reasons. The biggest problem that we had from a marketplace perspective was that after a certain period of time, our value to those designers diminished. So the upfront value that we were providing very quickly after they'd established those things, they didn't need us to provide those things for them anymore. And so, after running their first, second, or third collection, they would essentially jump off our platform and do their own thing, which, again, in hindsight, completely understand. It took us a while to see what was going on. But, again, from any business perspective, it's very, very hard to grow, maintain, or let alone grow a business when you're kind of in a marketplace dynamic. Your kind of top sellers are jumping off. And we looked at a couple of different models, and we kind of tried a couple of different things. But after 3 years, I think we all sort of the co-founders and I just got to a stage where we felt like we had tried everything and we couldn't quite seem to make it work. So we decided to take a weekend away just to really openly talk about how the business was going, figure out our way around it, and all those sort of things. And I think we just got to a stage where, I think all of us were just really burnt out from the experience. And so I remember I think it was the last night that we were there, we decided that we would take a break from the company and come back to it. So we were like, maybe we just need some time, some fresh perspectives, and we'll come back and figure it out. And then I remember waking up the next morning and just for the first time in a really long time feeling like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And I think that was kind of the point for me, that it was like, yeah, I feel like I have done everything to try and make it work, and it's been a really good run. And, we could keep running this in the current model, with a business that's relatively reached its ceiling, or kind of keep just the wheels turning. But I think for me and the other co-founders in the business, I think we all had sort of greater ambitions for what we wanted to achieve, with the time that we were sort of devoting to Stage Label, or just the time that we had. And so I think very just organically, we all just kind of went our separate ways, and never really sort of came back to Stage Label. So I don't think that there was like an official sort of ending to it, but I think we were all just at a stage. Again, I can't speak for the other co-founders, but we were all at a stage where it just felt like the right thing to do.
Yep, makes total sense. Did that feel like a failure to you at the time, or did that knock your confidence or anything? Or did you actually see it as just, look, we've done everything we can, it's time to move on? What was your kind of feelings around then?
Yeah, so I guess it was definitely, for me, it was probably harder than anyone else. So I guess the other co-founders were still working part-time, most of them. So they still had a backup option. I was the one that was mainly sort of pouring all of the money that I had into the business. I was also kind of the face, quote unquote, the face of the company, in terms of just being the forward-facing person who would go and do all the pitches and go and speak to everyone. And, I guess the hardest part about a business like that, especially when you've been running it for a while, and when you get good, I guess, surface level traction or visibility, is that everyone kind of associates you with that, and it becomes such a large part of your identity that it is very hard to detach from that. And it is very hard to kind of feel like, that you're not a failure, and all of those sort of things tied into one. And it does take a really long time to get that. Like I still randomly like get messages from people, or like run into people who will be like, oh, like what happened to Sage Label, or you were like the fashion tech guy from years ago or whatever. So it's still there. And I think it definitely takes some time. And I think there's, I wish that there were sort of more open conversations around this, because I think when you go through an experience like that, it can be very isolating, and feeling like, I'm the worst business operator in the world. Why did I think I could do this? And all of those sort of things. But I think it's really understanding that, everyone goes through this to some degree. Even people that have successful businesses, have periods where things just don't work out, and you kind of question everything all the time. It was definitely like a difficult experience. I think also the tough part was that I didn't really know what was next. Like I had committed 3 years of my life and pretty much everything into something that, I was very conscious that might not work, but I also didn't really leave myself with a backup option. And it's also very hard when, you feel like you're a jack of all trades when you're running a startup. You're across everything. You don't know necessarily how to describe your skill set to someone else.
Yeah, I get it.
If you're looking for a job. So I was like, what am I? Like I am, I'm a salesperson, I'm a marketer, I develop partnerships and all those sort of things. Like, what do I really want to do? How do I explain to someone what my skill set is if I'm looking for a job, and all of those sort of things. And, again, I think that process is just extremely, extremely humbling. I think the end of Stage Label was definitely one of the hardest moments of my life, because I'd invested all of my money. Like, I was literally sort of out of money, very close to being out of money, and all of those sort of things. And I think it's, for me anyways, like it's been so important to have a humbling experience like that, because it just grounds you with a lot of different things in general. But I think also just understanding that if you can go through a really difficult period in your life and come out the other side of that, there's not much else that you can go through that is, going to sort of knock you down. And if you can go through it once, that you've been there before and you've done it. So it kind of takes away, again, going back to that whole being prepared for the worst case scenario, you've gone through worst case scenario,
Yeah.
then the chances of that happening again are slim to none. Like, you'll be better prepared next time. But also, if you are in that position, you know that you've gone through it before. So it's really bad.
Yeah, I get it. It almost gives you that confidence where you know you can go through it, you have gone through it. So if it helps you just be less, I guess, anxious about sort of decisions in the future, because you know you've been there before, so you know you can handle it. So I get that. So you shut down Stage Label, you all went your separate ways, the founders. What happened next for you there?
So what happened next was, I was really trying to figure out what that next step was. And I remember feeling like I had to fill that hole with something. So like waking up every day and feeling like you had a mission and a purpose around something, and suddenly not having that is a very weird feeling to go through. And I think that actually, like, more so than the financial side of it, like just the emotional having to deal with all of those things was really, really hard. And so, it was jumping from terrible idea to terrible idea. Like I said, like I found it very hard to describe what I did. So I was finding it very difficult to get a job. A, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. B, I didn't know how to describe what it is that I could bring to the table for particular companies. And so it was a couple of months of like really me sort of drifting along and trying to figure out what that was. And then I eventually got focused a little bit more on wanting to, like, I think I got to a stage where I'm like, I had been so focused on this one particular startup for a while. I've now jumped between so many different ideas just because I feel this pressure to do something. Like, I don't think that that's the right approach. So I need to take a step back and just essentially just take a step back and kind of re-energize myself and be in a position where I can, where I'm back to what I was like before, in a sense. And so I ended up applying for 2 jobs. One was inside a sort of corporate innovation team, and one which was for a not-for-profit organization called Startup Victoria. And again, it's kind of like a theme in my life, but the Startup Victoria role offered less than half of what the corporate role offered. And so my natural instinct was to go for the not-for-profit position. But again, like, I think part of it was I wanted to remain really close to the startup ecosystem and just really do those things. I had benefited so much from Startup Victoria providing me opportunities when I first moved to Melbourne that I really felt like it was an opportunity for me to give back. But selfishly, there was also, I really had no networks at all at that time. And I knew that, if I'd spent a year, not to say that joining Startup Victoria was a step back, but taking a step back from, running a startup to being a community manager at a not-for-profit, and being in a position to help other people, that if I did it in the right way possible, it would help propel me for the next thing that I wanted to do. And so kind of those were a lot of the factors that that made me sort of want to join up with Startup Vic. And, again, I was fortunate or unfortunate at that time. We didn't really have a CEO, and it was me and another guy named Thomas Arnbeek that were running the organization between us. But I got to make up my role a little bit, which was to really, try and meet with as many people as possible and figure out how I could be helpful. For co-founders, it was everything from, for startup founders, it was just helping them with go-to-market strategy, or just helping them sort of brainstorm different parts of their idea or where they should focus, connecting them onto co-founders or investors or those sort of things. Just really trying to be a valuable person as part of this community was kind of my objective, and just figuring out how I could do that at scale through the initiatives that we were doing, but also trying to develop those relationships one-on-one, and just, as I said, just going back to like, how can I be helpful to other people?
Yep. It's a good strategy. Helping as many people as you can will always get you far.
It's always the right way.
Absolutely. So when did the podcast come about? When did you decide to start a podcast?
Sure. So the podcast came while a lot of it was driven by the conversations that I had with founders while I was at Startup Victoria. I just noticed that a lot of them had very, very similar questions about their business and about growth. And obviously, I had a particular experience or perspective on things, but by no means was I an expert or had all of the answers at all. I only had that one particular startup, and I had particular lessons that I had learned, but there was so many things that I didn't know. And I knew that there was so many, again, like I've just always been very fortunate from, very early on to somehow weasel my way in front of people and just be able to ask, grab a coffee with them and have conversations with them. And again, especially in the startup space, I somehow just kind of got into being able to network with a lot of successful founders and investors and those sort of things, and just being able to sit down and have those conversations with them. One of my favorite things with podcasts is that I just kind of get drawn into the conversation, and so I don't really have notes as part of those discussions. So what I was finding through a lot of these coffees was there was so much information that was being shared, but I wasn't able to retain them because I wasn't taking notes, because I was so focused on the conversation and keeping that conversation going. But also I felt a little bit selfish in the fact that, I had access to these particular people and they were sharing that information with me, but there were so many other people that would benefit from hearing that information from other conversations that I was having. And either they didn't have access to this person, or they couldn't get in front of them, or they just didn't know that this particular person existed. So that's very much like how the podcast started was, selfishly, I just wanted a way to have something that I could look back to from conversations with incredible people. But I also just wanted it to be something that, anyone who was interested in learning more from people that had been there and done it before, they could kind of tune in and listen in and take away what they needed from that.
Yeah, it makes sense. Make it turn into a win-win situation. You're having these conversations anyway. You may as well record them for yourself and for others as well. I totally love that. It's a good setup. And so did most of your initial guests come through that work that you were doing with Startup Victoria and sort of connections from that? Is that kind of how you got your first bigger guests? Because you did get some quite big names right off the bat. Is that where they came from?
Yeah, so I launched with 6 episodes straight off the bat, which was part of the launch strategy, which I can kind of talk about in a bit more detail if you want. But a lot of them were just personal relationships that I built up over not just Startup Victoria, but through stage label days and just people that I'd known in the space for a really long time. Justin Dry, who is the CEO of Vinomofo, was probably the biggest name that I had launched with. Vinomofo just raised $25 million in funding. They're still one of kind of the most popular or well-known startups in the Australian startup ecosystem, and was very fortunate to get Justin. How that specifically came about was that I had actually helped their head of PR get in touch with a journalist because she was looking for someone, and I'd put her in touch, and they had a great piece that was written up. And I just replied back to her and said, hey, by the way, I'm thinking of launching this podcast. I'd love to have one of the co-founders of Vinomofo on, if at all possible, if they're keen to do something like this. And she's like, absolutely, no problem. Leave it to me. I'll make it happen. And so she completely teed that up. So I hadn't actually spoken to Justin prior to that podcast interview, I don't think, or we might have exchanged emails. But I think a lot of it was just luck as part of that. But the starting point for me was definitely reaching out to people that I already knew in my network, or people that could introduce me to someone who'd be worthwhile listening to.
Makes sense. Start with who you know, a little bit of luck sometimes as well, and then also just helping people. It always comes back to you, like we said before. So I love that. So you mentioned your launch strategy just before. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. How did you get that initial traction? Because you, right off the bat, you got high ranking in iTunes, and you've kind of stayed pretty high in the rankings since then. So what was your strategy initially to get that traction?
Yeah, so first of all, and this is how little I knew about podcasting. So for context, in terms of me saying that I was thinking about starting a podcast, I hadn't really listened to that many podcasts previously. It literally just came from, I've had all of these conversations before. I just want to be able to interview them and record them. I'd listened to a handful of podcasts before. I'm like, that seems great. Maybe I'll do that. And I gave myself my girlfriend was away in Bali at that time, and East Timor at that time for a month. And so I told her that I would launch a podcast by the time she got back. She's like, I'm sure this is just like a crazy idea, and he'll probably get over it in a week or two. But what she didn't factor in was that I had ended up promising all of these people that I would launch the podcast within a specific date, which was 3 weeks from the moment that I decided to launch a podcast. So, that kind of external pressure, like one of the things that I've learned about myself over the last few years is that I'm terrible at keeping myself accountable, but as soon as I am accountable to other people, I'm just much more committed and much more likely to get things done. And so that was I was saying, like, especially someone like Justin, who I didn't know previously, who had taken the time out and essentially taken a chance on this new podcast. I didn't want to let him down and not deliver on the promised date. So part of my strategy was just understanding that, I didn't know what it is that people would want. What I wanted to do was, if I launched, I wanted there to be at least one episode that people would listen to and resonate with. And then if they liked it, there was at least one other episode to go to, where oftentimes I would kind of listen to the launch of other interviews, and, I would essentially forget about the interview because I really liked that. I didn't have something else to refer back to, and I would subscribe, but I just wouldn't follow up with the other episodes. The upside with that is that the way that the iTunes algorithm works is that it's based on the amount of downloads per time. So the more frequently that you post interviews, the more downloads that you're likely to get. But also, if you launch with 6 and you've got one person that's listening on, they're not just downloading one episode. If they like it, they'll listen to 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, which massively helps with kind of the ratings and the rankings. And so, I knew that was important. And so that wasn't kind of a key part of it. For me, it was more, I just wanted, like, if I'm pushing this out to people, I just want them to like at least something, and then it will have been worth me sort of reaching out to them and asking them to listen to it. So I didn't know that there were even rankings on iTunes to that degree. I actually had a friend who just who's a podcaster I reached out to previously, who said, congratulations on the ranking. I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, oh, you're number 3 on iTunes, and this is 3 days after we launched. And I was like, what? How do I check this? And so he showed me, and so I was like, oh my God, I had no idea. And so I took a bunch of like screenshots and stuff.
Save that for later.
I'd save that for later, and let the podcast guests and stuff know as well, which, I guess getting that traction early on really helped in terms of credibility and bringing on other guests. In terms of, again, sorry, I'm jumping around, but to go back to answering your question in terms of what was part of the launch strategy, aside from launching several episodes at once, a lot of it was based on how can I get this out to as many people as possible. So one was going out to friends who had mailing lists. The other was, a lot of the guests that I have on the show have pretty large followings online. So if they're sharing, they're likely to bring their own traffic through that. I ended up writing for a few publications as well, guest posts on particular interviews, which helped. But I think the biggest thing was going back to the coffees. I had individually met with about 80 or 90 founders over the previous 3 months, with no agenda, just of like, how can I help? And I then ended up writing a personal email to all of them saying, hey, I hope you enjoyed our catch up. I hope it was valuable for you. Just wanted to let you know I've launched this podcast with these people. I would really appreciate it if you kind of checked out an episode, and if you liked it, shared it with someone that you think would find it valuable. And writing like 80 personalized emails takes a long time, but I think more than anything else, I think that was a key driver in the success of that. But also, I think, like, just going back to luck as well, like I was just very lucky in terms of the timing of the podcast launching too. So this was, I think next week is about 3 years since the podcast launched, if I'm not mistaken. And, at that time, there were a lot of business podcasts, but a lot of the things that people listen to were, or a lot of the podcasts that were out there were very much focused on the US market or with US guests. And my initial impression of launching the podcast was that, I would put something out there and, I would then, it would then be this huge thing, and I would, jump online and interview all of these people globally, like the most successful people. But all of the feedback, and I think it's still up on the iTunes ratings and reviews part of the podcast, is there's so much feedback that was there that was, it's so great to have an Australian perspective on startups and business, and so great to kind of see something with a more local context that I can relate to. And I was like, great. I did not expect this at all, but this is what people that are listening to the show really resonate with. And so I, especially for like the next sort of 6 months to a year, I really, really heavily focused on providing a very Australian context to that, because they were essentially the early adopters of my podcast. So I just wanted to make sure that the reason that they were listening to me versus any other podcast, I was making sure that I hit that as much as possible.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense. It's sort of finding that audience and that missing gap. A lot of people were interviewing the massive tech entrepreneurs around the world, but no one was really doing the Australian market. So you sort of filled that gap nicely, which is awesome. I want to reiterate that point that you made about sending out the 80 personal emails, because a lot of the time people are looking for the hack or the algorithm that they can try to game to get that initial traction, but a lot of the time it is just that hand-to-hand combat of sending out 80 emails. I interviewed another guy, Dan Dembski, who's the founder of Unbound Merino, which is a clothing brand, and he said the same thing when he was doing his initial Kickstarter launch. It was all about he sent personalized video messages to everyone in his network who expressed interest in supporting him, just asking them to do it, and took him like days to do it, but that's what he attributed the initial success to. So I think it's worth reiterating that point.
Yeah, and there's no guarantee that everyone or like a large proportion of people will follow through with that. Like out of the 80 people that I had helped without kind of expecting anything in return, even if like 10 or 20 of them listened, that was 10 or 20 people that I might not have gotten. And I think it's kind of important to keep that in context as well. Is that just because you're doing something that's like really difficult, it doesn't mean that you're guaranteed that it will work or that people kind of owe you something. It's just more doing what is required to give you that additional boost or that additional leg up.
Totally. And do you directly monetize the podcast at all?
That is one of the biggest, like most frequent questions that I get is, after 3 years and 100 plus episodes, how do you monetize the show? And again, I think part of being relatively early or getting that traction really early on, there were a lot of people that reached out very early on for sponsorship and have since done that as well. For me, I decided quite early on that I didn't want to monetize the podcast through ads. For a couple of reasons. One is I've been in situations before where you have sponsors and you have to focus more on making sure that you hit specific needs for them. And the podcast for me was always like, I think it works because I ask the questions that I want to ask. I have on the guests that I want to have on. It is my kind of creative outlet more than anything else. And I think that's why people kind of tune into the show. But also, the unit economics of podcasting aren't great. Unless if you're a Joe Rogan and you get millions of downloads per episode, the unit economics around taking ad sponsorship, just you're not going to make enough money generally to survive. And so I almost kind of took it in the other direction, which is I am going to brand it as like the show that doesn't have sponsorship on. And the way that but the funny thing is like, so through my agency, maybe the podcast doesn't necessarily directly give me money through ads, but the amount of clients that we've had because they've been listeners of the show and they've reached out and they've wanted something, even though I've only probably mentioned our agency maybe 2 or 3 times in the entire show, or when we're going out and speaking to clients and they already know us or feel familiar to us because they've listened to the show before, they know the type of people that we get on the show, they feel like they already know us, which gives us a leg up over other marketing agencies. It's just been like there's just so much more ROI that's there that's indirect that I think people often overlook when it comes to something like this. And again, like I've been very fortunate that I've been able to monetize that way. Like I completely recognize that other people don't have that type of opportunity. I just for me, I just never felt that podcasting directly through ad sponsorship was going to be the right model for me. And I also just felt like it would just make things kind of take the love out of podcasting, out of it for me, and the reason why I was doing it.
Yeah, makes total sense. And I love that you're not directly monetizing it, but in a way you're monetizing it on the back end, like you said, by it's almost like lead generation for your agency. You're not doing it because of that, but it's just a nice byproduct of the podcast, which I love.
Yeah.
So,
sorry, just on that as well. Like I think, again, like I think I was very fortunate that I had the podcast before I had the agency, because I think a lot of people that I speak to now that have seen, my podcast or other podcasts and how effective it's been for businesses in terms of lead generation or growth, I think a lot of them now want to start a podcast as a new marketing channel for their business. But their expectation, or the reason why they're doing it, is because they want to see leads coming in. And for me, it didn't take, despite all of the traction that I had early on, it took me 9 months until I saw any form of return on investment in terms of someone directly coming on because of directly coming on board because they were a client, partly because I then had an agency. But, I feel very fortunate that for me it was just like, I didn't even think that I could monetize this way. Versus I think if you go into it with the expectation that you need to see a specific number of leads coming in, it is very hard to go through that after that initial phase of, I really want to start a podcast, to going, I've got this podcast. I need to keep doing this on a weekly or a fortnightly or a monthly basis. I think is exceptionally hard when you have those additional variables on top of like, why am I doing this? Why is there no money coming in? Why don't we have leads? I've got all of this other stuff that I should be prioritizing. So again, like very fortuitous on my side, but I would say like, anyone who's thinking about podcasting or content or thinking about things from a longer term perspective, it's really understanding that it is a marathon and not a sprint. The return on investment is huge and it's there, but you kind of have to be around long enough to see the upside coming through. And it's difficult to know when that tipping point is, or if it will ever be there, right? Like I'm sure you have this with the show as well. Like, and like you're 20, 30 episodes in?
Yeah, about 25. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure you've kind of gone through the phase of like, why am I doing this? On a basis. I think podcasting or anything like this is really, really easy to start. I think the value of this is kind of staying consistent and doing it long term. The hardest part is that in between phase where you just feel like you're going through the motions and you need to do it, and there are weeks that you don't feel like doing it, but you kind of have to keep that consistency up.
What's your advice to someone if they are doing something, whether it's a podcast or some other form of content, and they're kind of, that initial enthusiasm has worn off and they're kind of in that dip? Did you experience that much yourself, and how did you get through that?
I go through that all the time, to be honest. I think with, anything like this, it goes in ebbs and flows. I took 6 months off last year just because I got a little bit burnt out with everything, the podcast included. It was just way too much with the agency, and we were trying to launch an accelerator and all of those sort of things as well. I just needed a break, but having that break also just kind of took me back to why I love doing this and why I wanted to come back to doing this as well. But, I think that's a really tough question in terms of how do you stay consistent when you lose the motivation, because I think it's so different for everyone. I think, a lot of people have asked me that question. I feel that I'm almost the worst person to answer that question, because I feel like I don't have that in so many aspects of my life, or so many different things that I've just tried and I haven't stayed consistent with. This, for whatever reason, was the right thing for me. And I think part of it is just understanding, is this actually the right sort of medium for you to be focusing on, or the right thing is part of the battle. Like, you can stay consistent with something, but, it could also mean that you spend 5-6 years of your life going nowhere. Is that the right approach, is to stay consistent to it? Like, I don't know. But, one of the things that's helped me, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is just, I think so much of like life or business or any of this stuff is just understanding yourself more than anything else. And I think for me, the biggest lesson that I've had with a lot of the things that I've tried is that, again, I'm so much more accountable to other people than I am to myself. And so my little hack for that was that at the end of every episode, I said that, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you at the same time next week. And I didn't ever want to get to a phase where I was like, I don't want to deliver on it next week, because I didn't want to go to a startup event, or I didn't want to have someone emailing me or whatever saying, hey, you said that you would deliver this next week and you haven't delivered it next week. Not that I think anyone would care or that it would impact anyone's life. I just didn't want anyone to feel like they were let down as a result of that. And so that was like my personal little hack. That may or may not work for other people. But yeah, as I said, like I think so much of this is just understanding what kind of ticks for you, understanding why you're doing it. Again, for me, I think the more that I remove myself from the equation and think like I'm doing this because I want this particular outcome, and more thinking about like I want to launch this particular podcast or do this particular thing because it will benefit these other people. It just, for me, it's just me, but like I just feel like it just makes me much more likely to push through that pain barrier, or that kind of phase of, oh, I don't really want to do this, to you just have to do it, get it done.
Yep. Makes total sense. I love that, using your own psychology against yourself to keep yourself accountable. So tell me about Playbook Media, which is your agency you've sort of mentioned a few times. How did that come about, and what is Playbook Media?
Sure. So Playbook Media it initially started because I had left Startup Victoria kind of quite suddenly. I guess long story short, Startup Victoria got a new CEO, and the organization kind of developed a sort of different direction to what I had originally joined the organization for. So I just kind of felt like it was the right time for me to leave and for a new CEO to have the right team around them to execute on their vision. But that being said, again, like I was in that phase of like, oh, I've just taken a decision and I have no idea what I'm doing next. And so part of it was, I was in a much different position to me a year prior, where, I had a lot of these networks and relationships in place. I was trying to speak to people, and I also had a much better understanding of what it is that I wanted to do as well. And I knew that I wanted to be really hands-on, and I wanted to focus a little bit more on the marketing and the growth side, because I knew that that's what a lot of founders tended to struggle with. And I thought initially that my kind of jump would be into venture capital and helping companies with deal flow and helping with their portfolio of companies. But at that time, no real funds were sort of focusing on that. Also, funds are very rarely have roles that are open as well. So I think like timing was a part of it, but also like I just didn't have the experience or kind of the skills that they were necessarily looking for at that time. And I guess through that period, I just was again having so many conversations with founders that were asking me, we're doing okay, but we need to grow a lot quicker because we need to hit specific milestones to reach our next round of funding, or we have tried these particular channels, but we don't really know what to do or like how to optimize this particular area. Do you know anyone that could help us? And I was like, well, I've got some free time. Like, I'm more than happy to sort of help you out where I can. And I was like, I actually really enjoy getting back on the tools and doing that for a couple of different companies versus, having to necessarily do it on my own. So again, Playbook Media wasn't this huge vision that I had for an agency or anything like that. It was just very organically. I literally couldn't find a job that let me do what I wanted to do. So I went out and, created what I thought that I wanted to do, which is kind of the agency model.
Makes sense. I love it. So your first customers sort of came organically by the sounds of it. What's that experience been like? How long have you been running the agency now for?
It's been just over 2 years.
2 years, cool. And what's that been like? Has there been any massive challenges or things that you didn't think would happen when you first went in?
So many challenges. I mean, everyone told me going into it that agency or services businesses are really hard. And again, like very naively, which I think is a really important trait when starting a business, is, I was like, yeah, I'm sure it's difficult, but how difficult could it really be? It's much simpler than having to develop a product and trying to explain to people what this product is and those sort of things. But, services businesses are really, really hard. And I think it took me a really long time to understand the framework for agencies and how agencies work. And I think, there's also the balance and the alignment between the model that works for an agency, which is, you want people on long-term retainers, but that isn't necessarily the best outcome for your clients as well. And so it's kind of, there's been a lot of learning lessons in terms of going through that process, in terms of figuring out what does that model look like? What's our kind of unique sort of selling point? Where do we provide sort of the biggest impact to founders or to businesses? Work that you don't normally do, or working with clients that you wouldn't normally sort of work with. And I think that is more, it's also a learning lesson. Like you kind of find out that it might provide some short-term relief, but actually longer term, it causes a huge issue for you and for the agency and everyone that sort of works there. So yeah, lots of different lessons through this process. I think, I think like, to be totally honest, like I think one of the things for me is just understanding that, probably agency life won't be my kind of long-term thing. I think I got into it because I wanted to work on a couple of different businesses and kind of see that hands-on and be able to kind of take on learnings that way. And, I think Playbook Media and things like that have been sort of really effective in terms of like the learnings and things like that. And we've, gotten to work with some incredible clients as well. But yeah, I guess kind of like longer term, it's probably not what I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing.
Yeah, I understand. So what are you going to be spending the rest of your life doing? What's some projects that are coming up for you shortly?
Yeah, I mean, if I had the answer to that, then I would be completely sorted. But, I think, again, for me, it's sort of coming back to trying to find things that, give you the most joy and make you feel fulfilled every day. And not to say that, running Playbook Media and working with our clients isn't that, but I think it's just more sort of understanding what is it that I really want to be doing every day, and what do I sort of enjoy the most. And I think part of that is, I think it's taken me a while to realize this, but I really enjoy sort of community building as an aspect, because I think that in terms of business growth or deal flow for VCs or anything like that is just so critically important. But it's not a short-term thing, and it's not necessarily something that you go to an agency to and say, hey, can you go and build an engaged community for me? I don't think that's how it works, but it's something that I've kind of noticed that it's, again, I think you find out what you're really passionate about by finding out things that aren't necessarily related to work or aren't necessarily related to something that you need to monetize, but something that you're just extremely passionate about. So, for example, the fact that you're doing this podcast, outside of your kind of work, no one is forcing you to do any of this stuff. But the fact that you kind of put yourself through this, I think is a really big indication in terms of why you're doing this and how sort of committed you are to it as well. And so again, like I think for me, a lot of it has been, I have loved meeting with founders. I love trying to be useful and trying to kind of plug gaps where I can. And part of that is just kind of seeing a lot of the same things happen over and over again. And so I recently announced the launch of Playbook Ventures, which, I think has a longer term vision around it. But in terms of kind of what we're doing immediately is essentially trying to run initiatives that help provide startups with better access to capital and resources. The first initiative that we're doing as part of that is an event called Investor Connect that we're running on the 15th of August. And essentially the premise of this model, the premise of this event is that, I've had so many conversations with VCs on the podcast who say how important it is to build relationships with founders. But for a lot of founders, it can be really difficult to pull themselves away from the day-to-day of running their business and updating their product to, especially for those founders that are new to the space, that don't have the network or the relationships to give them warm introductions to VCs, to the right VCs, is really, really hard. And so, again, I've just been in a really fortunate position where through the podcast and through other things, I've just been able to build, relatively close relationships with a lot of the VC community in Australia specifically. And so at this event, we're bringing together, I think it's about 20 of Australia's best VCs and angels. So Blackbird, Airtree, SquarePeg Capital, Grok Ventures, which is Mike Cannon-Brooks's venture fund, and angel investors like Chris Reid, who used to be the former managing director for Xero in Australia. And I think someone was telling me that all of the funds that we've got at the moment represent over $1 billion of capital, which is also super exciting, that there is that size of capital available in Australia. And essentially, so again, kind of the event is we're flipping the model of what the traditional relationship building is like, and instead of doing pitch events, we're matching each of the investors that come along to 2 to 3 startups that meet the stage, verticals, themes that our investors are interested in investing in. So from a startup perspective, you'll meet one VC that is interested in the space and interested in kind of the stage that your business is at. And from a VC side, they're meeting with at least 2 to 3 companies alongside the 60 other companies that will be in the room and the other sort of 20 odd investors that are in the room as well. So again, from my perspective, it's less about, expecting any funds, any sort of startups to close deals on the spot, but it's more about, how do you create those initial moments of like relationships being built? How do you kind of create those moments of serendipity to occur by bringing awesome people together in a room? So that's kind of, in terms of immediate stuff, that's what's next and what I'm sort of focusing on at the moment.
That's cool. I love that. I really see that as an amazing thing, Investor Connect, because not many people could actually do that, what you're doing. And it really has come about from these years that you've spent, I guess, curating these relationships, building these relationships with people and investors and also startups, and sort of being involved in that ecosystem. You're almost like the marketplace that is bringing these two sides together. And there's really not that many people who could do that. So I think it's, again, another gap that you're filling, which is awesome. And I can see a lot of potential for this. So I'm really excited to see how that plays out for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I think one of the themes that I've probably mentioned way too much on this podcast is, I think it's really important from a business point in terms of finding what's your sort of unique selling point. I think from an individual level as well, you also have to think about, out of all the things that you could do, why are you uniquely placed to do this one particular thing, and what's your unique selling point? And, it's, for all intents and purposes, it's an event where we bring together startups and VCs. Anyone can do that, and I would encourage everyone to do that, because it's a great way to build up relationships on both sides. But I think kind of testament to the event is just the quality of people that we have in the room. Kind of the who's who of the VC fund, and from some of the applications that we've seen of startups that are already generating between sort of $1 to $5 million in revenue is super exciting as well. So hopefully this will be the first of many such events, and hopefully just as I said, I think there's so much potential in the Australian startup ecosystem. I think there are so many amazing founders that are doing incredible things. Sometimes you just need that sort of little push, or you kind of need that break, and you need that sort of one relationship to help get you through the door and kind of open up opportunities. And if I can sort of play some role in that, or kind of help facilitate for that to happen, I think that's massive for me personally.
That's awesome. I love that. Yeah, well, all the best with that event and everything that will come from Playbook Ventures. So as I said, looking forward to watching how that plays out. So sort of coming up on the end of the interview here, Rohit. It's been a long one and a good conversation, so I appreciate you hanging around this long. But is there anything I haven't asked you, or just anything you really want to make sure that you pass on to the audience before we do finish up here?
It's a really good question. I think you've done an incredible job in terms of interviewing the podcast and getting the information out. I don't know. Like, I would just say, as I kind of said earlier, like, I think it's really important to understand that when you're kind of going through difficult moments in things, to understand that you're not the only person, and that there are other people that are out there to help. And like I said, like, I think it's really important to have other people there that you could talk to that can sort of understand what it is that you're going through. And so I would encourage anyone who is listening to this and to reach out to someone. And if you don't have someone, like, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to have a discussion and things like that. Like I said, I've been through this kind of process before, and I can share some of the things that have sort of helped me overcome or kind of get through those moments and periods of doubt. But yeah, I would just say, like, again, like, I just don't think that there's enough that's being done in terms of focusing on founder mental health, because it is very tough. It is extremely isolating and all those sort of things. So, not to end on like a sad note or anything, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of let people know that if they are kind of part of it, going through part of that journey, and just are feeling really isolated, or just kind of feel like they just need to vent or kind of talk to someone about this, please find someone around you, or if not, I'm always open, so feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, that's very generous of you, Rohit. And yeah, everyone listening, he'll definitely respond to your email. It's amazing that you've kind of built your way up into the startup ecosystem by getting people to take these coffee meetings and sort of going and having these conversations, and you're now doing that for other people as well who are just kind of starting to come through as well. So I love that you do that, and I think it's awesome. So yeah, what is the best way for people to connect with you if they want to reach out, if they just want to check out all the stuff you're up to, or if they want to get in touch? What would you say is the best way?
Sure. In terms of, like, I'm not difficult to find online. I just kind of jump between different things, so it might be difficult to get me to respond on email or LinkedIn. But in terms of how to find me, I've got a personal website that I just launched, which you can find at rohitbhargava.co. So rohitbhargava.co. The podcast is startupplaybook.co. What else is there? playbookmedia.com.au. You can find me on LinkedIn's probably the best bet. I'm pretty responsive on LinkedIn or Twitter. My DMs are open. So again, like, anyone who wants to have a discussion around any of this sort of stuff, or like I said, just vent, feel free to reach out. And James, honestly, mate, awesome job in doing this as well. I've met so many other people doing podcasts who just don't get up to even 20 episodes. So yeah, kudos to you. And I think you're doing an awesome job.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Rohit. And I was inspired because I sort of set a goal for myself that I want to get to 100 interviews. So when I first saw your podcast, I saw you had just hit that milestone as well. That was some inspiration for me. So I'll definitely keep going. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. You've got a lot of it from over the years. So thank you very much. Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to this interview with Rohit. I hope you got a lot of value from it. If you use Apple Podcasts to listen to this show, can you please go into the app and leave me a rating and review for this episode? Because that really helps me out with the show ranking and helps spread the message and helps more people discover the show. And if you don't use Apple Podcasts, you can still help me out. Just take a screenshot of you listening to this episode, post it to Instagram stories, tag me in that, tag Rohit as well, and hope you all have a great day.